I've said it before, I'll say it again. One of the things I absolutely treasure about this international teaching lifestyle is the connections that you can forge and then so often maintain after you leave a certain country, when you go back to your country of record, and so on. And it's been just such a fantastic opportunity. I feel so blessed to have been able to stay in touch with former colleagues as well as former students, a lot of times through Facebook. And we've met up with students when we were on vacation, traveling to a certain country. It's just such a joy to be able to reconnect with students that we've had over the years. And today represents one of those connections, and that person is Julia Walker. Julia was in my phys ed class in 7th grade at Singapore American School a number of years ago, and she was a joy to teach at the time. We were so excited that we heard her speaking on the International Teacher podcast that we said we've got to reach out, reconnect with Julia, and find out what's going on in her life and talk to her about being an international teacher kid, which is a particular niche that she was part of, along with our own kids. Julia grew up in Canada, Egypt, and Singapore before returning to Canada for university. And now she's completing her master's degree in environmental science in Switzerland, of all places. I'm super envious. When she's not studying or hiking in the mountains, she's doing a podcast called Across Oceans, where she interviews TCKs, also known as CCKs, and discusses everything related to being a TCK. Our guiding question for the episode was, what's it like growing up the child of international educators? And as I said, we're teacher parents ourselves, David and I, and we enjoyed hearing Julia's insights about what it means to be an ed kid growing up internationally. We discussed some of the positives and negatives of growing up as a teacher's kid. Julia shared some funny stories, and we chimed in with a couple of our own. We unpacked ways that parents can acknowledge and support the cross-cultural nature of their children. And Julia also outlined the purpose and the next steps for her podcast. We had so much fun having this chat with Julia, and I had my own kids in the back of my mind. David had his own kids in the back of his mind the whole time we were talking about the various aspects of being an ed kid. This episode was recorded on January 13th, 2023. Here's Julia.
Hello, Julia, and welcome to the podcast. We're so excited to have you on and learn about your life and experiences. But where in the world are you?
Hello, thank you for having me on the podcast. I am in Switzerland.
Yes, and I was wondering, you were wearing such warm clothing. Here, I'm sitting in a cafe on the porch in Mexico. It's about 34 degrees Celsius, so I think we're kind of opposite ends of the world when it comes to temperature, that's for sure.
I think so.
So, yeah. We were talking a little bit before we started about some of the stories that you've had growing up as a third culture kid and the child of educators. Do you have a story for us?
I do. So one of the biggest benefits, I would say, to growing up in an international school setting is the amount of friends you make and where those friends will end up as adults, and having this great network of people all around the world. And sometimes you might not even know where those people are. And so in my third year of my bachelor's program, I was able to go to Shanghai for a research internship.
Cool.
And it was a really cool experience. I was super happy to be back in Asia after 3 years of living in Canada for my bachelor's. And I thought, well, I'm in Asia. I wonder if there's other friends from high school in the area. So I reached out to my network and asked around, and I found out that my friend Evan, shout out to Evan, was going to be in Shanghai at the same time. But as we know, Shanghai is a huge city, and I thought, well, we're most likely going to be at opposite sides of the city, probably will only see him once, maybe twice, because my school that I was at an outside district, so not really in the city center. And so he arrives in Shanghai after me, and we're scheduling to meet up. And we find out that his internship placement is across the street from my school.
Oh, no way.
And so it was amazing. We got to catch up after 3 years of not seeing each other and hang out all the time. And just one of the wonderful things of having friends everywhere.
That's so awesome.
Yeah.
So that really connects nicely to our guiding question, because growing up as a TCK, but you're kind of on another level. So our guiding question is, what's it like growing up the child of international educators? And so we'd like to start with a sub question about being a teacher's kid. How is that different from being just a regular kid at an international school in your experience?
It definitely is a unique experience and brings different perspectives, I think, than just being a regular kid at an international school. So we talk a lot about culture and being raised in a diverse cultural experience as a TCK. And most of your experiences or perspectives are coming from your parents, but also the school you attend, as well as the host country that you're living in, and even the organization that your parents work for. And so for most people, that's something different than the school they're attending. Their parents might be business professionals or missionaries or in the military. But for me, my parents were teachers. And so there's this overlap of culture and ideas and perspectives coming from the international school that I was attending, but it was the same place that my parents were working. And so I feel like that created a lot of positives, like community, for example, but also there's nuances and I think maybe challenges to that as well.
Mm-hmm. My kids would echo that.
Yeah.
So breaking it down a little bit, what are some specific benefits as you go back and look at some of the experiences you had? What were some areas where you go, yeah, this is pretty good being the child of international educators?
I definitely think the community of international teachers is really strong. And I found anyways, at least with my parents, most of their friends were other teachers. And so that really gave a sense of community for us because teachers would be at our house on the weekends or we would go over to their house for dinner. And it really created this strong network that I think is even maybe stronger than teachers' kids in a domestic setting, for example, because in an international setting, our true extended families are really far away. And so the international teachers that I had, both as teachers but as my parents' friends, kind of became our families. And I see some of my parents' friends who might have been my teachers as well, more so as aunts and uncles than teachers, especially now that they're no longer my teacher. So that's definitely a huge positive.
So Uncle Greg over at the ITP, for example.
Exactly. Uncle Greg, we love him. But also being in a school where my parents were there all the time, they were able to be at my choir concerts and sports games, whereas some of my friends had business parents who were traveling all the time. I was really lucky to have my parents there to see all of those things of mine.
Awesome. Yeah, that's very true. You know, we would be able to ask someone to cover our class and be able to go to the class party and or go to the play or what have you. And certainly as teachers, we would attend a lot of their sporting events and so on. So that's a really good point. You're certainly a definite part of their lives. And then another benefit I would add is, at least from a parental point of view, you get the same vacations. And so where a lot of these business people's kids, often the trailing spouse and the kids would be off at the same time, and the parent who was working wouldn't be part of whatever vacation they were taking. So I think that was a huge thing.
Absolutely. And for us too, as kids, having your parents on your vacation, or especially with how frequent teachers get vacations too, and for how long they get time off, it was definitely really nice.
And to add to that is the idea that, especially for our listeners new to international education, is you often travel with this group of educators who become close friends. I remember when we were in Saudi, Audrey, we would all go to Thailand, to Chiang Mai for the winter holiday. And it really is a close family. That's so cool you bring up that point. It's a community within a community. And I'll share a quick story more from how great it is to be a parent and have my children in the school. In Hong Kong, I was in the upper primary and my eldest son, Sam, was there. And every other day, I would have lunch with him. I would just look at my schedule, know when he's going in. And he thought that was the coolest thing in the world to say, here's my dad, he's sitting down with me. Or the other part is just catching your children, whether it be in the hallway or like you were saying, seeing a performance like during the day and seeing them in their just growth stage of experiencing new things and their camaraderie with their friends. It is something so special.
That's so true. In fact, in Riyadh, we even had the opportunity to, because the daycare was right at school, so you could even go and feed your baby during your lunch break. So that was pretty awesome as well.
Definitely.
So definitely a lot of benefits. What might be some challenges of being a teacher's kid in an international school?
Of course, the community is there and your senior teachers outside of class and also in class. So I think it just creates a really unique dynamic between teachers and then the teacher kids. I think maybe there are even conflicts of interest at times that teachers would face with other teachers having children. Like, for example, even Audrey, you were my teacher, but you were also the coworker and friend of my dad. Like, that's a very unique situation.
True.
And then also just having your parents see everything that you do all the time at school. And from the good and maybe the not so good, coming home and wanting to tell your parents, oh, I did great on my math test. And they're like, oh, I know, I saw your teacher in the hallway. So you're like, oh, I guess this is okay. It's fine.
Right. Definitely no place to hide in that situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, my kids both had their dad, and we'll have to ask you in a sec if you ever had one of your parents as a teacher, but they both had their dad for math because math was streamed. And so the level they were in, he was the only one that taught that class. And it was tough because what do you call them for one thing, right? In class, do you raise your hand and say, Dad, excuse me? And then also, Mark kind of likes to goof around with kids. One of the things he does on the first day is he says, this is the bathroom pass. You can take it and go. But this is my whistle and nobody touches my whistle. And then he licked it to make sure no one would touch it. Well, my kids would sink down in their chair when that happened with total embarrassment.
Oh, definitely.
Yes, your parents can definitely embarrass you at school. Yeah. Sometimes when that's tough. Oh, I forgot. My daughter being in health class and hearing from her friends. Luckily for her, she wasn't in my health class, but when we did the sexual and reproduction unit and she's saying, oh my gosh, Mom, my friends are telling me that you talked about delivering me. So embarrassing. So yeah, definitely there's that side. Have you got any stories like that, David?
I really don't. I think as our children age and they move into middle school and high school and they're going through adolescence, I think the probability of our embarrassing them goes higher and higher.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
For sure. Julia, do you have a story or two about your parents putting you in a compromising position or just something funny or interesting that you experienced with them at school?
I think it's very true that as you age, you get more embarrassed by your parents, at least as a teenager. And now I'm living at home with them again, and we're good now, no longer embarrassed by them for the most part, but as a teenager, for sure. And so in my last year of high school, I had a boyfriend, and his mom also happened to be a teacher at the school. And we hadn't told our parents yet that we were dating, but our moms were in the same book club. So moms talk, teachers talk. So they found out before we told them. I think my dad also found out from another teacher who had said, oh, I saw them in the hallways together. So as my first boyfriend, as a senior in high school, that was mortifying at the time. But now it's hilarious to look back on.
Perspective.
Yeah.
Did you ever have either of your parents as a teacher?
I had my mom, but just briefly for a couple months, so it wasn't too long. And yeah, it was kind of strange, but also it was a very small school, so it was just kind of what had to be done.
Bound to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, on a different note, how can parents help support their TCK, CCK kids in childhood and on into adulthood because of this particularly special situation?
I think in general, it's really good to talk with your kids a lot, especially as they're growing up and especially as they move into middle school and high school, kind of navigating what are their needs, but also the needs of the parents, especially as they get older and they start making decisions for themselves. I have a story as well from, again, when I was in 12th grade. I was not wanting to participate in one of the school events that was happening. It was my last year of high school, and it was kind of an event more for the incoming freshmen to be there to get to know each other. And at that point, I had my friends already, and there were just a few weeks left of school. And so I said to my parents, can I skip this event? Can I just hang out with my friends instead of going to this? And they said, well, no, you can't. What would that be if a teacher's kid wasn't at this event? Because you're kind of representing your family as well as yourself. And so it brought kind of a pressure to be at this event. And so, I mean, in the end, they told me it was my decision and I would have to suffer the consequences if there were any of skipping this event. And so I did. It was my rebellious moment in high school. But yeah, like just talking with them, laying down expectations, but also doing your research. I think now that we have more cross-cultural kids around the world and international teaching is becoming a lot more common, it's good to do your research to know what it's going to be like for your kids. And specifically, I have 2 book recommendations if you're looking for that. The first is The Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among Worlds Global book. I actually have it here. And it's coined to be the Bible, quote unquote, for third culture kids. But I think it's also really useful for parents to read or even teachers to help kids in their classrooms. It has a whole bunch of tools for navigating transition and also just a lot of resources for students. And then the second one is The Third Culture Kids, the Children of International Educators, specifically. I found really interesting and validating reading other stories of specifically educator kids, and they even called them ed kids. I haven't really heard that term before, but I guess that's what we are ed kids.
Okay.
So yeah, looking into these resources and I mean the internet, even what you guys are doing, I think is really beneficial to teachers starting their career, thinking about having children overseas or bringing their children overseas. I think it's really great that you are doing this for teachers and in all the resources that you're providing them.
Just to dig in a little further into, you mentioned transitions, because that's something that's really can be a challenge for a lot of people. Do you have any thoughts, and also perhaps from some of the reading that you did, some things that parents can do to help to smooth the transition? For example, I know that TCK, CCKs, if there are 5 levels of friendship, CCKs, because of moving around and becoming adaptable, they jump right to level 3 so quickly with new friends, but they never get to level 5 because there's always this idea in the back of your mind that someone's going to leave. What has been your experience around transitions?
I think that's a very true point. I think we as TCKs, CCKs who have moved a lot are definitely in that mindset where we want to get to know people really quickly and on a deep level right away because we don't know how long we'll be there or how long another person will be there. And so you really want to value the time that you have with the people in your life. And so that definitely relates to transitions because we often move a lot in international schools with our parents moving around to teach at different schools. And so I think learning to sit with your emotions around transitions and maybe getting out of that mindset a little bit too of needing to jump right to the deep level because not everyone works that way, and that can also create challenges when meeting new people, especially transitioning back to your home country, for example, for university or work or whatnot. People who have grown up in the same place, they might not really understand that that's what you're trying to do and why you want to be on that level so quickly. So yeah, just being mindful of transitions and giving yourself grace that it might be difficult, but also it makes you very adaptable because you have moved a lot and you are able to navigate, I think, the world maybe a bit better.
Would you agree with the idea that when you transitioned, particularly when you transitioned back to your home country, you have a tendency to seek out people with a common background, common experience?
Definitely. Like, you are looking for people who understand maybe your upbringing or have a similar experience in that way. And depending on where you go to school, that might be more difficult to find, or maybe there'll be a great community of CCKs that you can find and relate to. But yeah, definitely.
Because I always found it interesting. My son, when he went back to the States, wanted to really immerse himself in that culture and that situation. So he almost didn't really tell people about his background, at least until he got to know them better. And then my daughter really wanted to be very upfront about it right from the beginning. And this is who I am. And so they had very different approaches to that whole situation. And interestingly, my daughter really didn't find people that she considered true cross-cultural kids at her university. And she was in Boston. You would totally think that that would be a lot, but she would say, well, I have a friend who's Indian, from India, studying in the US, but that's not the same as a kid who grew up in a third country. So I thought that was really interesting.
Absolutely, and that definitely rings true or resonates with me, both in the sense of how much do you divulge to someone? Like, do you go into your whole backstory and try to explain how you grew up, or do you just say, oh, I'm from Canada, and leave it at that?
Yeah.
Because, yeah, people can take it the wrong way too, thinking that you're bragging by saying you grew up in all these different places. But at the same time, if you neglect it, you're like erasing your childhood, which also doesn't make sense and isn't right, because that's just the facts. That's just how we grew up. And so it's definitely a choice we have to make, I think, on every interaction we have, of like how much to divulge and how we make friends and network as we move forward.
Well put.
Well put. So I want to dig down on one thing, but also mention just the point that international school kids who have parents who are teaching, well, it can be in one's home country too. You're under a microscope, and people are looking at you maybe in a different way. And as you said, one of the most important things, and I'm a counselor that I work with parents on, is from the get-go with your children, open up those avenues of discussion, build in times every week that you definitely have family meetings, so that when they become adolescents and teenagers and naturally are kind of pushing away and finding out who they are, that those avenues of discussion are still there. And it really, really applies, as you're saying, for these international kids who on one hand are so used to change in their lives and they adapt in general, but it still can be very profound to move to a new place. And so that's the second thing I wanted to bring up. Audrey, that's an interesting point about the friendships. So when I was getting my master's in counseling, I did my thesis on military families. I grew up in a military area. Not a lot of research out there. But one of the big things was, just as you're saying, Julia, is in general, the students would be pretty quick to make friends, find out who's in the know, where to make those connections, natural networking. And then sometimes with that first place where they land, they make those good friends, they go to the deeper level of having a deeper friendship. And it's after that, when they move on to that next place, that they go, ouch, and they have a little scar tissue, that they had that good friend or friends, they've left them, they kind of naturally fall into making new friends, but that's when they become a little bit more reticent about saying, do I really want to make good friends again? And whether it's on the conscious or unconscious level, that is a big deal. And we're hoping to have Doug Oda on at some point. He's a real leader in the field of transitions and how schools can help support that. And as you're saying, we have books out there like his book to help parents as they really help their children see their strengths. What are all these attributes of being a third culture kid, and how do we use them, but also how do we validate those emotions when we're not feeling so comfortable, when we're feeling stressed out because something happened embarrassing at school and dad saw it today? Those things that come up. So all that is a big part of being a child of international educators and a cross-cultural kid.
Absolutely.
Well, I would take it a teeny bit further in terms of the whole friendship thing. I think that teachers and adults experience that same kind of thing as well. We make friends easily, but not necessarily BFFs because, yeah, you don't know if you or they are going to be leaving.
Mm-hmm. And I
Yeah.
think it can be really hard too, is like transitioning into adulthood. You're like, is this just how adult friendships are too? Or is it more a product of how I was raised? And so it can be maybe even more difficult for a young person as they like start navigating their own life and reevaluating the friendships they do have and making friends going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Let's shift gears a little bit. I was saying before we got started, I was listening to your latest episode of your podcast. You're a podcaster.
Mm-hmm.
Super
I
cool.
am.
And I'm listening as a learner and a father. My sons are in their mid-20s. And I really want to keep learning about what it means to have grown up as international kids like they did. So it's very helpful for me to learn when I listen to your podcast. So what got you motivated and how did you get started as a podcaster?
Yeah, so I do have a podcast. It's called Across Oceans, and it deals all about the TCK experience. I interview different guests, and it kind of stemmed from my own identity questioning when I was finishing my bachelor's. I was kind of like, what's my next steps? Like, who am I? Where did I come from? And there was at a time when it was lockdown, so there's lots to think about, but also listen to. And I thought, oh, I wonder if there's any sort of TCK podcasts out there. And so I searched, and there were a few, but a lot of them came from the perspective of missionary families, which is not what I'm from, evidently. So I felt I could have a different perspective and also provide a niche for other TCKs to come on and talk about their experience, but also share my experience as a ed kid, but also a TCK. So it took a while from conception of figuring out that I wanted to do that in 2020 to I actually published my first episode in 2022. So I sat on the idea for quite a while, but we got there and I enjoy it.
It's very cool. So what are your plans for the year coming up?
Well, so far I've interviewed mostly friends of mine who have been TCKs themselves and grown up with me in the various schools that I went to. But I want to expand it to a more diverse range of people and not necessarily people within my close network. For example, I've already reached out to a TCK therapist that I found, and I'm going to get her perspective on, she was a TCK herself, but also how she works with clients now to help with their transitions and all of the things they deal with being TCK. So that's one direction I want to go, and bring in other experts or other people in the field. So
Cool.
yeah.
Well, we will keep on listening and enjoying.
Yeah, stay tuned for that. I also have an episode coming out soon, or it might be out by the time this episode is out, interviewing another teacher's kid. So bringing in that perspective as well.
Yeah, awesome.
Well, excellent. So please share with our audience how they can follow your podcast and if you are on social media. We will put everything in the show notes, but it's always great for people to hear it as well.
Yeah, for sure. So it's called Across Oceans, and you can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. On Instagram, we're at Across Oceans Podcast, or Gmail is acrossoceanspodcast@gmail.com. And for the next few months, I'm going to be guest writing on Jacqueline Mills' blog, talking about being a TCK and a teacher's kid. So you can find me there as well.
Excellent. Good for you. Did you reach out to Jacqueline or did she reach out to you?
It was kind of one of those small world moments, but in a virtual sense. So I had just listened to her podcast on Greg's ITP podcast, and I was like, oh, this is really cool. She has a blog. I reached out to her offering to write some articles for her. When she responded to me, she said she had just listened to my episode of Greg's that very morning. So it just worked out. It was serendipitous. So
that's so cool. So we just keep making connections in different ways.
Exactly. It's a very small world we're working within. So,
Oh, it is. We love it. Well, thank you so much, Julia. It's great to see you again. And thanks for taking the time to have this conversation and give us your insights on being an ed kid. And you taught me a new term as well. We really appreciate it.
yes, thank you for having me, and so nice to see you again, Audrey.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel
Teach
and connect with us.